a storyteller, and I'd like to share with you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of a single story. I was an early writer, about the age of 7. I wrote my stories with pencil and crayon illustrations. I wrote exactly the kind of stories I was reading. All of my characters were white and blue-eyed. They ate apples and played in the snow. I had never been outside of Nigeria. I had never seen snow. We ate mangoes. And we didn't talk about the weather because we didn't need to. But when I discovered African writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamala Laye, I went through a mental shift in my idea of literature. I realized that girls like me, with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could exist in literature. Now, I love those American and British novels. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was I didn't know people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to a university in the United States. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked how I learned to speak English so well. And then she asked to listen to my tribal music. She was disappointed when I pulled out my tape of Mariah Carey. What struck me was this. She felt sorry for me, even before she knew me. Her default position towards me, as an African, was a patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa as a place of catastrophe, and in this story there was no way I could be similar to her. Now this single story of Africa ultimately comes from Western literature. British writer John Locke wrote about black Africans as beasts that have no houses, having their heads and eyes in their breasts. Now I laugh every time I read this, but what his writing represents is a tradition of telling African stories in the West, describing Africa as a place of negatives, difference, darkness. And I must quickly add, I am too guilty in the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the United States. The political climate at the time was tense. There were endless debates going on about immigration. And soon, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans fleeing the border, getting arrested at the border, and that sort of thing. But when I went to Guadalajara, I saw people walking to work, rolling up tortillas, laughing, smoking, and that sort of thing. I was surprised. And then I was overwhelmed with shame. I had bought into a single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to make a single story. Show people as one thing only, over and over and over again. And that is what they become. It's impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. Power is not just the ability to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. I recently spoke at a university. An American student told me it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers, like the father figure in my novel. I told him I just read American Psycho, and it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. So the single story creates stereotypes. And it's not that stereotypes are untrue, but that they're incomplete. They make one story the only story. It's impossible to engage with a person or place without engaging with all the stories of that person or that place. The consequence of the single story is it robs people of dignity. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. Every time I'm home in Nigeria, I'm confronted with the same sources of irritation. Our failed infrastructure, our failed government, but also the incredible resilience of people despite the government. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her southern relatives who moved to the north. She showed them a book about the southern life that they left behind. She said they sat around reading the book, listening to her read the book, and a kind of paradise was regained. I'd like to end with this thought. Once we reject the single story, once we realize that there's never a single story about any person or place, we regain a kind of paradise.